Vanished without orders. The 2010 case of Private First Class Ethan Ward. The Hook. Fort Benning, Georgia. A fortress of discipline, precision, and silence. Inside its iron gates, thousands of soldiers march, train, and sleep under one law, the law of command. Every breath is counted, every step documented, every name accounted for. No one simply disappears here. Not from this place, not from the system. But on the night of April 12, 2010, something happened that the Army still refuses to explain. Private First Class Ethan Ward, a 21-year-old infantryman with a spotless record, went missing, not in battle, not on leave, not during transport, but from within his own barracks. His bed was made. His boots were aligned. His uniform hung neatly by his locker. His car was still parked outside. His wallet, phone, and identification all untouched. There were no signs of struggle, no alarms, no security alerts. And yet by sunrise, Ethan Ward was gone, as if he had simply been erased from existence. What makes this case disturbing isn't just the disappearance, but the response that followed. Within 24 hours, the Army labeled him a deserter. Case closed. No search parties, no public investigation, no press statement. But his family refused to believe it. His friends insisted he wasn't that kind of man. And those who served beside him spoke of something darker. Whispers of secret tests, hidden experiments, and nighttime movements in restricted zones. 15 years later, Ethan's name is still absent from official records. His personnel file remains sealed. His disappearance is now treated as rumor, something that never officially happened. But behind the paperwork, something doesn't add up. Too many lies, too many coincidences, too much silence. Because the truth is, soldiers don't just vanish from Fort Benning, unless someone wanted them to. The soldier from Ohio. Ethan Ward was not the kind of man who ran from responsibility. Born in 1989 in a quiet town just outside Dayton, Ohio, he was the middle child of three, quiet, thoughtful, and fiercely loyal to those he cared about. His father, a retired mechanic and Vietnam veteran, used to say, "In this family, we finish what we start." Ethan lived by that rule. Even as a teenager, when others chased parties and quick thrills, Ethan preferred the discipline of routine. Early runs, late-night workouts, and a fascination with the order that the military seemed to represent. Neighbors remembered him as the boy who mowed the entire street's lawns just to keep things looking right. Teachers described him as shy but dependable. He didn't stand out, but he was the kind of person who made everything around him run smoother, unnoticed but essential. His high school yearbook quote read, "Honor isn't a word, it's a choice." When Ethan graduated in 2007, the world was still deep in conflict. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were taking their toll, and recruiters were visiting schools across the Midwest. Ethan didn't hesitate. He enlisted the same summer, telling his parents that the Army would make him a man. He was assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, home of the U.S. Army Infantry School, a place where recruits were turned into soldiers. From the very beginning, Ethan took to the Army like he was born for it. His training reports spoke of quiet excellence. He wasn't the loudest or the strongest, but his commanders trusted him. He kept his bunk spotless, his uniform perfect, his weapon maintained beyond regulation. He volunteered for every extra drill, every inspection, every early shift. Yet, under the surface, there were signs of strain. Letters to his family started upbeat, but gradually grew more distant. His handwriting changed, sharper, rushed, almost paranoid. He began hinting that something was off at Fort Benning. One letter, dated March 27, 2010, said, "Things feel strange here lately. We've been running drills that aren't on the schedule. There are new faces, officers who don't wear name tags. They say it's stress testing, but no one talks about it after. If you don't hear from me for a bit, don't worry. They're watching everyone lately." His mother didn't understand what he meant. She thought it was just fatigue, the result of long training hours. But Ethan's friends began noticing changes too. He became withdrawn, quieter than usual. At night, he sometimes sat outside staring toward the tree line behind the barracks, a dense patch of forest that soldiers called the Dark Belt. Rumors spread that strange lights appeared there after midnight. Some soldiers claimed they heard distant metallic sounds, like machinery under the ground. Ethan didn't believe in rumors, not at first. But a few nights before he disappeared, he told his roommate, Private Lewis, "I think there's something out there. Something we're not supposed to see." Lewis laughed it off, thinking Ethan was overtired. But the next morning, Ethan didn't join the formation. He said he wasn't feeling well. He went to the infirmary, stayed there a few hours, and returned later looking pale and shaken. He didn't tell anyone what the medic said. That evening, he made a strange request. He asked Lewis to take care of a small notebook if anything weird happened. Lewis thought it was a joke and didn't take it seriously. That notebook was never found after Ethan vanished. Looking back, everyone who knew Ethan agrees on one thing. He wasn't planning to run. His bank account was untouched. His ID and wallet were left behind. His boots were still neatly beside his bed. And he never once mentioned leaving the army. If anything, he wanted to stay and figure out what was happening around him. But that decision may have cost him everything. Because at Fort Benning, curiosity was not a good thing. And in the weeks before April 12, 2010, Ethan Ward had started asking the wrong questions to the wrong people. Fort Benning, the hidden city. Fort Benning isn't just another military base. To the average American, it's the symbol of training, discipline, and excellence. The birthplace of infantrymen, paratroopers, and officers who go on to shape the backbone of the U.S. Army. But to those who've lived inside its walls, it's something far more complex. Spanning 182,000 acres across Georgia and Alabama, Fort Benning is a city unto itself. It has neighborhoods, schools, churches, and even its own police force. Yet most civilians will never see its deepest sections, the zones labeled restricted access or classified training environments. These are areas with no public maps, no visitor permissions, and no record of what goes on inside. Every soldier stationed there knows the same rule. Don't ask questions about places you don't need to know. Ethan Ward's unit was assigned near the southern edge of the base, close to a sector known unofficially as Range 74. On paper, it was described as an abandoned testing field, just woods, bunkers, and an old communications tower. But many soldiers whispered otherwise. They said Range 74 was active again, but not for standard training. Night after night, truck convoys rolled in without insignias. Floodlights would flicker for seconds and then cut off. Strange mechanical hums could be heard from beneath the ground, followed by silence. Once, a group of new recruits accidentally took a wrong turn and drove toward the range. They were stopped immediately by armed MPs and told to forget the route. Ethan's interest in the area started innocently. He had guard duty near the southern fence and noticed certain patrols avoided that section altogether. Cameras along that perimeter were frequently offline. When he asked his commanding officer why, the response was curt: "Ward, stay in your lane." But Ethan couldn't. He wasn't a rule breaker by nature. He was just curious. The kind of curiosity born from knowing something didn't feel right. Then came the unofficial drills. Soldiers were told to report at midnight to a warehouse on the edge of the training ground. Their names weren't logged. No one wrote it down in official records. Inside, the lights were dim, and unfamiliar men, not wearing standard uniforms, stood with clipboards, asking questions that sounded more like psychological evaluations than orders. They'd ask things like, if you were told an enemy lived in your mind, would you obey it? Or, do you believe the body could be reprogrammed under stress? When soldiers laughed it off, the men would simply write something down and move on. No explanations. Ethan told his roommate Lewis that after one of those sessions, he felt off, like he couldn't remember parts of the night. He said there were flashes, bright lights, strange frequencies, and the sound of machinery. He joked that they were messing with our heads. But the laughter didn't reach his eyes. Over the next few weeks, several soldiers in Ethan's platoon reported sleepwalking, vivid nightmares, and sudden nosebleeds. The medics dismissed it as fatigue or dehydration from the heat. But a few quietly went to civilian doctors outside the base, only to be called back by their commanders within days. Their appointments were canceled, and they were told the issue had been handled internally. One weekend, Ethan visited a local diner outside the base with a friend. They sat near a retired officer named Cole, who overheard them talking about the range. Cole leaned over and said quietly, "Some parts of Benning are older than the Army. You boys should keep your eyes forward and your mouths shut." Ethan asked what he meant, but the old man just smiled and said, "Not everything they train you for is war." The following week, Ethan noticed his name had been added to a list of soldiers reassigned for psychological evaluation training. He wasn't told what that meant, and when he asked his superior, the officer said, "It's routine. Everyone gets it eventually." But Lewis never got the same notice. Neither did anyone else in his unit. From that point on, Ethan's behavior changed. He began to distance himself from others, spending hours writing in his notebook or walking the edge of the forest alone. He told Lewis, "There's something under there, underground. I can feel it." At first, it sounded like paranoia. But then, one night during guard duty, he heard metallic clanging echoing from beneath the dirt, faint but rhythmic, like the turning of gears deep below. He mentioned it to another soldier, who went pale and said, "Don't talk about that. Ever." In the following days, lights appeared again over Range 74, bluish glows that hovered low, too still to be aircraft. Ethan tried to report it. The officer on duty just told him, "Ward, your shift is over. Go get some rest." But he couldn't rest. He started writing letters again, this time shorter and more cryptic. One of his final ones simply said, "If anything happens to me, look under Range 74. A week later, Ethan Ward vanished. The night he disappeared, April 12, 2010, began like any other day for Private Ethan Ward. The weather in Fort Benning was humid, the air heavy with the scent of pine and earth. He had completed his morning drills, participated in squad exercises, and spent the afternoon cleaning and inspecting his weapon. By 9:30 p.m., the barracks were quiet. Soldiers were preparing for lights out. Ethan spoke briefly with his roommate, Private Lewis, about an upcoming inspection. Lewis noted that Ethan seemed distracted, glancing repeatedly toward the edge of the forest near Range 74. He laughed nervously and said, "I'll probably be called for another assignment tonight." Nothing unusual. Lewis didn't press. He thought Ethan was just tired. Lights went out at 10:30 p.m., and the barracks fell silent. Around 10:47 p.m., Lewis heard faint metallic banging from the far side of the building, like a gate slamming or machinery being moved. He assumed it was maintenance personnel, but the sound stopped suddenly. When he went to investigate, there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The doors were locked, as per protocol. The only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system. When morning came, the scene was unnerving. Ethan's bunk was perfectly made. His uniform hung neatly, his boots aligned beneath the bed. His wallet, ID, and keys were untouched. His phone, still plugged in, showed no missed calls or messages. Everything about his space was undisturbed, except for a small, faint reddish stain on the floor near his locker. It was minor, almost easy to miss, but someone on the morning shift noticed it and recorded it in the report. The sample was sent for testing, but the results were never made public. The base security cameras covering Ethan's barracks had malfunctioned precisely between 10:40 p.m. and 12:15 a.m. No technical report explained why only those cameras failed. The Army later claimed it was a temporary power surge, but technicians acknowledged it was the only blackout of that month. No other parts of the base experienced downtime. By 5 a.m., when the morning roll call took place, Ethan's bed was empty. His roommate, alarmed, reported it immediately. Within hours, the military police sealed the barracks and began questioning soldiers. Officers recorded statements, checked logs, and reviewed limited surveillance footage. Everything indicated that Ethan had simply disappeared. Yet there were anomalies. No departure was logged. No vehicle left the base. No gate records showed him leaving. The Army quickly categorized him as AWOL, absent without leave. Family members were notified through formal letters. And in one unsettling detail, Ethan's mother received the official notice before the base even contacted her by phone. While the official line called it desertion, fellow soldiers whispered about strange activities around Range 74. One soldier recalled seeing Ethan on patrol the night before his disappearance, staring toward the forest as if watching something invisible. Another said he seemed pale, restless, and muttering about the underground. The events of that night remained puzzling. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no evidence of escape. Yet Ethan Ward was gone. Like a ghost, he had vanished inside one of the most secure military installations in the world, a place designed so no one could leave unnoticed. The only things left behind were questions. Why did the cameras fail? What caused the small reddish stain? And most importantly, where did Ethan Ward go? The official story. When Ethan Ward didn't appear for roll call, the Army acted quickly, at least on paper. Within 24 hours, the official statement was issued. PFC Ethan Ward is absent without leave. He is considered a deserter. The wording was simple, cold, and definitive, but it left more questions than it answered. No mention of the malfunctioning cameras, no note of the mysterious reddish stain, and no acknowledgement of the strange activities reported near Range 74. To anyone who knew Ethan, the claims seemed impossible. His mother, Mrs. Ward, received the Army's letter at her home in Ohio. The letter described her son as absent without authorization and implied he had intentionally abandoned his post. When she called Fort Benning to demand more information, she was told that the investigation was ongoing and that she needed special clearance to access any details. No explanations were provided about the night of his disappearance. Local newspapers and civilian authorities were largely shut out. Police in Columbus, Georgia, offered to assist, but their jurisdiction ended at the base perimeter. Any attempt to investigate was blocked by military officials citing security and confidentiality. Even reporters were denied access, told that inquiries into Ethan's disappearance could interfere with military operations. Meanwhile, Ethan's friends and fellow soldiers tried to make sense of the situation. They remembered him as responsible, disciplined, and loyal, the last person likely to desert. His car was still parked on base. His bank account was untouched. His identification and personal belongings were all left behind. If he had planned to leave, there was no sign of it. Some soldiers privately speculated that the desertion label was a convenient cover. Others whispered about unusual training sessions in restricted zones, about officers asking odd questions, and about lights and sound in the forest near Range 74. A few recalled Ethan expressing unease in the days before his disappearance, feelings of being watched, of something hidden from ordinary soldiers, something he wasn't supposed to see. The Army maintained the official stance: Ethan Ward deserted. And on paper, that was all anyone needed to know. But for those who had known him, the story didn't add up. Desertion would have required premeditation, planning, and intention, none of which fit Ethan's character. His careful nature, his loyalty, and his family ties made it nearly impossible to believe he would simply walk away. The disconnect between the official record and the reality experienced by those close to him created a tension that would grow over the following weeks and months. The Army's declaration of desertion left the Ward family frustrated, powerless, and desperate for answers. Even outside the base, the story began to circulate among military families and veterans online. Forums discussed the case, pointing out inconsistencies and raising questions that the Army refused to answer. Whispers of special programs, psychological testing, and classified operations began to surface. Rumors Ethan himself had mentioned in the days before his disappearance. The official story was simple, neat, and convenient. But the truth, it seemed, was anything but. Whispers from the barracks. After Ethan Ward vanished, a quiet unease settled over his unit at Fort Benning. Soldiers who had once joked and trained together now exchanged furtive glances. Conversations became cautious, measured, almost rehearsed. No one wanted to mention Ethan by name, and those who did were quickly warned. Officers reminded them of the consequences of insubordination, citing military law and disciplinary codes. Yet the whispers persisted. A handful of soldiers began talking off the record about what they called unofficial assignments, night sessions where recruits were called to empty warehouses or forested areas under orders from officers who didn't wear name tags. These sessions were never logged, never documented, and never explained. Participants were instructed to perform drills that seemed designed not for combat training, but for psychological observation. Isolation exercises, simulated stress scenarios, and tests that induced confusion and fear. Some soldiers claimed they saw Ethan in the days leading up to his disappearance, being escorted by men in plain civilian clothing, officers, perhaps contractors, who asked him questions in low tones. One such question reportedly was, "If the body could be reprogrammed, do you follow instinct or orders?" Ethan had apparently responded politely but nervously. That same evening, he returned to the barracks pale, disoriented, and unusually quiet. He confided to his roommate that the sessions were weird and not what anyone should have to do. The atmosphere in the barracks changed rapidly. Soldiers began to notice unusual behaviors in their peers: sleepwalking, nightmares, sudden fainting spells, unexplained nosebleeds. A few reported hearing faint metallic sounds from beneath the forest floor near Range 74, like underground machinery operating far from any base facility. Medical personnel attributed the symptoms to fatigue, dehydration, or stress. But some soldiers suspected something far more disturbing: that Ethan's disappearance might have been connected to these secretive programs. Letters he wrote home in the weeks prior to his disappearance hinted at this unease. One line read, "If anything happens, it won't be on the schedule. Don't be surprised if they don't tell anyone. I'm watching, and they know it." The intensity of his fear grew as April 12th approached. He began documenting small anomalies: the time certain trucks moved at night, lights flashing in the forest, officers who appeared only briefly in hallways before vanishing. Friends later recalled that Ethan was meticulous in his notes, unusual for a soldier, even one as disciplined as he was. Then, the night he disappeared, the whispers became reality. Soldiers who had been stationed near him noticed something different in the air: an oppressive silence, as though the base itself was holding its breath. Lights in certain zones flickered. Security cameras went dark. Metallic sounds echoed in the distance. And when the morning roll call came, Ethan Ward had vanished entirely. The barracks never fully returned to normal. Soldiers reported that the tension lingered for months, and the name Ethan Ward became something like a quiet warning, a reminder that asking questions could make you disappear. What happened to him that night remained unknown, and the whispers, the stories circulating in the shadows of Fort Benning, hinted that the official explanation of desertion was only the surface of a much deeper, darker truth. The civilian investigation. Ethan Ward's disappearance didn't just disturb his fellow soldiers. It shook his family and the surrounding community. His parents, unable to reconcile the Army's claim that he had deserted, immediately sought help. They reached out to local law enforcement in Columbus, Georgia, hoping that civilian authorities could investigate what the military appeared to dismiss. The sheriff's office agreed to look into the matter, but their jurisdiction was limited. Fort Benning was federal property, and only military police could operate freely inside the base. Detectives could ask questions, take statements from those off base, and examine surrounding areas. But the core scene, the barracks, the cameras, the hallways, remained entirely off limits. Still, the investigation began. Officers canvassed nearby areas, interviewed Ethan's friends, and retraced possible escape routes. They discovered that Ethan's car, keys, and wallet remained untouched inside the base. Security gates had recorded no exit. Every civilian accessible path was accounted for, with no evidence that he had left Fort Benning by ordinary means. Then came a chilling development. About 40 miles from the base, near Pine Mountain, hikers stumbled across partial human remains dressed in what appeared to be military fatigues. They contacted local authorities, and the sheriff's department moved to secure the site. Before forensic teams could examine the remains in depth, military personnel arrived on the scene with federal orders. The body was removed, and official statements claimed it was federal property that required specialized handling. Local detectives were told they could not pursue the case further. The remains were never publicly identified. Detective Robert Keller, who had been leading the civilian inquiry, recalled later that the Army's intervention was swift and overwhelming. Officers did not explain why the remains were taken or where they were transported. Keller stated in interviews, "It felt like the military was cleaning up something that wasn't meant to be found. The evidence vanished before we could even touch it." Despite these obstacles, Keller and his team tried to follow every lead. They spoke with soldiers who had been stationed with Ethan, civilians who occasionally saw activity around the base at night, and even retired personnel who hinted at secretive nighttime drills. Every conversation, however, was filtered through fear. Those willing to speak quietly off the record often faced transfers, disciplinary warnings, or threats. Meanwhile, Ethan's parents refused to accept silence. They sent letters to congressional representatives, federal oversight offices, and veterans advocacy groups. Each inquiry received the same response: an acknowledgement of receipt, followed by a statement citing national security exemptions and the inability to release any information. The civilian investigation highlighted one stark reality. The disappearance of a soldier was not merely a question of discipline, protocol, or desertion. When federal authority intersected with the secrecy of Fort Benning, evidence could vanish, and questions could be buried under layers of regulation and classification. In the weeks that followed, civilians and veterans alike began compiling unofficial records. They noticed patterns: soldiers vanishing under similar circumstances, files sealed without explanation, and families left to navigate bureaucracy alone. Ethan Ward's case was no longer an isolated incident. It was part of a growing and disturbing puzzle, one that civilians could glimpse but never fully access. And yet, despite all attempts, the trail remained cold. No confirmed sightings, no official investigations, and no public answers. The disappearance had transcended the boundaries of ordinary law enforcement and entered the shadowed corridors of secrecy. For the Ward family, the lack of resolution became its own form of torment. Each unanswered question, each dismissed request, each blocked avenue of investigation reinforced the impossibility of recovering the truth. And for the soldiers who remained, it was a reminder that Fort Benning held layers of activity that even the highest-ranking officers would not discuss. Ethan Ward's disappearance was no longer just a mystery. It had become a symbol of the power of silence, of a system capable of erasing a person and leaving the world to speculate. A pattern of disappearances. Ethan Ward's case, while shocking, was not entirely unique. Across U.S. military installations, a quiet but disturbing pattern began to emerge. Soldiers disappearing without explanation, labeled officially as deserters or AWOL, but with circumstances too strange to be dismissed. Fort Benning, like other large bases, was heavily regulated. Every entry, exit, and personnel movement was tracked. Yet over the years, several cases arose where soldiers vanished entirely, leaving behind personal effects, vehicles, and no evidence of escape. In many instances, surveillance cameras malfunctioned at critical moments, security logs failed to show departures, and witnesses reported unexplained activity in restricted areas. Two cases stood out for their similarity to Ethan Ward's disappearance. 1. Fort Hood, Texas, Sergeant Daniel Chavez, 2007. Chavez was a communications specialist. One night, he disappeared from his barracks under circumstances that mirrored Ethan's. His personal belongings remained untouched, his car parked on base, and security cameras recorded a brief power fluctuation during the time of his disappearance. The official report labeled him AWOL, but Chavez's family swore he was dedicated to his unit and would never leave voluntarily. 2. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Technician Marcus Ellison, 2011. Ellison was responsible for maintaining electronic systems in classified zones. He vanished without warning during a scheduled night shift. Like Ethan, he had been writing cryptic notes in the days leading up to his disappearance, referencing experiments that shouldn't exist. The base quickly classified the case and denied family access to any records. Researchers examining these cases noticed a troubling similarity. Most of the missing soldiers were attached to units involved in experimental programs, testing advanced technology, psychological resilience, or behavioral conditioning. Often, these programs were shrouded in secrecy and conducted in off-limits areas like Range 74 at Fort Benning or equivalent zones at other installations. Former military personnel who spoke under anonymity suggested that these operations blurred the line between training and experimentation. The exercises tested mental acuity, stress tolerance, and obedience under extreme conditions. In some instances, soldiers were subjected to isolation, bright lights, repetitive noise, and confusing commands, all designed to simulate environments far beyond conventional combat. Ethan's disappearance fit neatly into this troubling pattern. Like Chavez and Ellison, he had been exposed to unusual assignments in restricted areas, had documented anomalies, and vanished without explanation. In every case, the official story simplified the narrative, AWOL or desertion, while the underlying activities were hidden under layers of classification. Families and independent investigators began to connect these dots, recognizing a systemic problem. Soldiers could disappear, and the mechanisms of the military allowed the erasure of their presence. Files could be sealed, cameras could fail, and witnesses could be silenced. What makes this pattern particularly chilling is that those who survive these programs often describe psychological effects long after they return to normal duties. Disorientation and memory gaps, sleep disturbances and recurring nightmares, persistent fear of certain locations, reluctance to speak about experiences even years later. In Ethan Ward's case, it appears he may have been exposed to such programs, placing him in a vulnerable position that ultimately led to his disappearance. Yet, unlike others, his family refused to accept the official narrative and continued to search for him, challenging the silence that shrouded Fort Benning. These disappearances raise difficult questions. How many soldiers have vanished under similar circumstances? How often are these incidents classified as desertion to avoid scrutiny? And most importantly, what really happens in the hidden zones of military bases where rules do not apply the same way? Ethan Ward's story was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was a window into a systemic mystery, a pattern of vanishing soldiers that the public and even most military personnel would never fully understand. Legacy and impact. Ethan Ward's disappearance left more than unanswered questions. It left a lasting impact on those who knew him, the military community, and families across the country. While his case remains unsolved, the echoes of his vanishing continue to resonate in ways both subtle and profound. The military community. Within Fort Benning and other bases, soldiers who served during the same period often recall Ethan's disappearance as a cautionary tale. Though rarely discussed publicly, it became an unspoken lesson about the dangers of curiosity, the consequences of questioning authority, and the shadows that exist behind the base gates. Some soldiers report lingering unease, suggesting that even years later, the memory of his disappearance affects morale and trust. Former personnel who speak on the record describe heightened vigilance, increased awareness of restricted zones, and a culture of discretion. The pattern of unexplained disappearances, like Ethan's, serves as a chilling reminder that not every aspect of military life is visible, and some truths are deliberately hidden. Impact on families. For families of missing soldiers, Ethan's story became both a warning and a source of solidarity. The Ward family's persistence in seeking answers inspired others to question official narratives and advocate for transparency. Support networks and advocacy groups have since formed, focusing on missing soldiers and those affected by classified military programs. These organizations aim to provide resources, legal assistance, and community support, ensuring that families are not left completely powerless. Influence on investigative journalism. Ethan's disappearance also attracted the attention of investigative journalists and independent researchers. His case highlighted the tension between military secrecy and public accountability. It became a benchmark for examining the broader implications of classified operations, restricted access zones, and the potential human costs of undisclosed programs. Some journalists used the leaked, Operation Nightfall, Phase 3 document as a starting point to explore other mysterious disappearances. Their work underscored the challenges of reporting on cases where official records are sealed, witnesses are intimidated, and national security claims prevent full disclosure. Public fascination and the mystery vault community. Among online communities, particularly those dedicated to unsolved mysteries and military enigmas, Ethan Ward's story remains a source of intrigue. Forums, podcasts, and discussion boards dissect every detail. His letters, his cryptic notebook, the strange activity at Range 74, and the leaked files. Speculation ranges from secret experiments and covert relocations to conspiracy theories that question the very nature of military oversight. The story resonates because it touches on a fundamental fear that even in a system designed for accountability, a person can vanish completely. That fear drives engagement, discussion, and ongoing investigation, making Ethan Ward a symbol not only of mystery, but of the human desire for truth in the face of institutional silence. Legacy of questions. Ethan's disappearance also leaves a legacy of ethical questions. What is acceptable in the name of national security? How far can secrecy be maintained before it endangers those it is meant to protect? And, perhaps most poignantly, how do we reconcile a soldier's disappearance with the system sworn to protect him? For families, for fellow soldiers, and for the public, Ethan Ward's story is a stark reminder. Truth can be elusive, authority can conceal, and in some places, answers may never come. Yet the drive to seek the truth, to remember, to ask, and to persist continues. In this way, Ethan Ward's legacy endures, not just as a vanished soldier, but as a symbol of the enduring struggle to uncover what is hidden, to challenge secrecy, and to honor those who disappear without explanation, vanished without a trace. Ethan Ward vanished from Fort Benning over a decade ago, leaving behind questions, fears, and a trail that seems to disappear into shadows. Was it a secret program, a covert operation, or something even stranger? A system capable of erasing a soldier without a trace? The truth remains unknown. What is clear is this: his story is not just about one man disappearing. It's about the boundaries of secrecy, the limits of authority, and the courage of those left behind to seek answers. It's about families who refuse to be silenced, soldiers who bear witness to unexplained events, and a world that rarely sees what happens behind closed doors. Ethan Ward's disappearance challenges us all to ask uncomfortable questions. How much do we truly know about the systems we trust? How many stories remain hidden, waiting to be uncovered? And what would we do if someone we loved simply vanished, leaving no explanation? Perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: in a place built on order, discipline, and accountability, a person can still disappear. And when that happens, the only evidence left behind is the story, the questions, the whispers, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Ethan Ward is gone, but his story is not. What do you think happened to him? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below.